At 7 a.m., Mom woke me up and said breakfast was waiting on the table. I opened my eyes but wasn't planning on getting up right away. Instead, I lazily stretched out on the bed. Mom noticed this, and, after giving me a magical kick, she left. That's when I immediately felt like leaving my warm, cozy bed and heading to the bathroom to wash up. In the kitchen, a glass of juice and a few sandwiches were already waiting for me. I grabbed one right away and started eating. Almost immediately, Dad joined me, and a little later, Mom came in too. "Mom, why are we up so early?" I asked. "Sasha, are you just goofing around?" Dad said. "Dima, could you just be quiet for once?" Mom replied. "Why should I be quiet? When did you last see your sister, by the way?" Dad shot back. Mom hesitated, then answered uncertainly, "Well, we were around 20. 20. And it doesn't bother you that it's been over 10 years since you've seen each other?" Mom rolled her eyes theatrically and turned to me. "Want some more juice? Need me to pour it?" "I'll pour it myself, Mom." "But really, why do we have to go? You got a problem with it? My vacation just started, and yet I'm up as early as if it's a school day." "Oh, poor you. Your dad and I don't get any vacation at all. And here you are, sleeping until noon every day for 3 whole months. Enough. This conversation is over. Get ready." Dad and I exchanged glances, feeling each other's resignation, then got up from the table. I stayed silent the entire ride, but Mom and Dad were bickering about something. I couldn't quite make out what they were arguing about, so I just listened to music instead of their quarreling. The registry office was still a long way off, and so was the start of the event, but I was already sick of it all. I just wanted to go back home. I didn't want any kind of celebration. I felt a sense of dread, and even Mom's words about other kids being there to play with didn't change anything. For a few seconds, I turned off the music and listened to my parents' conversation. "Why are you acting like this? Could you at least put on a pleasant face?" Mom asked, apparently for the 100th time that day. "Katia, I've already told you 100 times how I feel about this. Want me to repeat it?" Dad shot back. "But why are you like this?" "Why? What, are we incapable of going anywhere just once?" "We can. But not to visit these crazies." "And why exactly do you think they're crazy?" "Because Uncle Genio told me on New Year's that their whole family is out of their minds." "Oh, Uncle Genio said that?" "Uncle Genio, the king of lies," she snapped back. At this point, I couldn't take it anymore and butted into their conversation. "Mom, Dad, come on, can we just go home instead? And here comes another one. Sasha. What's it to you?" Mom snapped. "My stomach hurts," I lied, keeping a straight face. "What hurts?" Mom asked sharply. "My stomach," I said, sounding less confident. "Oh, really? And this stomachache didn't bother you at home, but it hits right now, does it? Do you even realize what you're saying? Your kid's got a stomachache, and you act like that." Dad stepped in to defend me. Mom went silent for a moment. After a few seconds, she finally said, "All right. We'll say our congratulations and head home if Sasha's stomach doesn't get better." "Fine," Dad muttered, then turned to me. "Is it really hurting that bad, Sasha?" "Not too much. I can bear it for a bit. If it gets worse, I'll let you know," Dad said gently. Mom then added sarcastically, "Oh, now you want to play the caring father? When the kid's glued to his screen all day, you don't say a word, but as soon as he's got a little tummy ache." Before she could finish, Dad cut her off bluntly. "Be quiet. If you don't care about your son, I do." Mom fell silent, staring out the window. Dad didn't say another word either, and I turned my music back on, doing my best to keep up the act that my stomach was hurting. To be honest, this was pretty rare for me. Usually, I was up for any little adventure, well, almost any. When we pulled up to the registry office, we didn't immediately spot Mom's relatives among the crowd. The bride looked different from the others. Instead of a white dress, she wore a plain, kind of dull, dusty blue dress that didn't suit her at all. She looked like someone had just died, honestly. The other guests weren't exactly bursting with joy either, though a few found it in them to talk and smile. Dad let out a low whistle after giving everyone a good look, then leaned over and whispered to me, "Sonia, as soon as the ceremony's over, we'll get out of here. Promise." I nodded in agreement, keeping one hand on my stomach to make it seem more convincing. The ceremony wasn't supposed to start for another hour, so I figured I'd better find something to occupy myself. I pulled out my phone, hunched over, and got so absorbed that I didn't even notice a girl approaching me. "Hi," she squeaked. Startled, I almost dropped my phone. "Geez, don't sneak up on me like that." Ignoring my words, she said, "My name's Nadia." "What's yours?" "Sasha," I answered reluctantly. "How old are you?" she asked. I glanced around and realized that my parents had disappeared somewhere, leaving me alone. It also became clear that Nadia wasn't going to leave me alone. 11, I replied flatly. "I'm 9. "Well, almost 10, in 2 months, she said, giving me an expectant look. Realizing my parents wouldn't be back soon, I decided, out of politeness, to keep the conversation going. "So, how are you planning to celebrate?" I asked. At what seemed to me like an ordinary question, she widened her eyes and, in a slightly lower tone, replied, "We're not allowed to celebrate birthdays." "What? What do you mean, you're not allowed to celebrate?" "Just that. We don't celebrate New Year's either." What she said sounded absurd to me, so I burst out laughing. I didn't even notice when Mom walked into the hall. She bent over me and asked, "Feeling better now, aren't you?" I fell silent immediately and tried to explain myself, but it was no use, she wouldn't listen to a word. As soon as the ceremony ended, I was just hoping we'd be done and could go home. And I was thrilled when we actually headed to the car. But halfway there, the bride's mother stopped us. "Katia, why are you leaving so early?" Mom glanced at me and said, "Well, Sasha's stomach has been hurting since this morning, so we decided to head home." "Oh, no. We've already bought food and prepared everything for you," the woman exclaimed, throwing up her hands. "Well, there's nothing to be done about it. We'll head home, then." "You'll go, of course." "Just say goodbye to Olga first," she insisted. "But we already have," Mom replied, but the woman simply took her by the arm and led her back inside. Dad and I stayed in the car, waiting for her. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and eventually, Dad lost his patience and got out of the car. When the car door closed behind him, it felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders. If Dad went in, that means they'll be back soon, I thought. But, as it turned out later, I was wrong, they didn't return soon at all. Things seemed okay, and I kept thinking we'd leave any minute, but my growing sense of unease began to creep back. When they finally walked to the car, they acted like nothing had happened. When the door opened, I asked, "Mom, Dad, what took you so long?" "None of your business," Dad snapped. Mom stayed silent. I figured they'd gotten into another argument, so I decided not to pry. But soon I had no choice. The thing was, we weren't heading home, we were following the wedding procession instead. "Mom, where are we going?" "Where else?" "Home. To the newlyweds' place." "But I thought we were going home, it's necessary, Sasha." "Be quiet now," Dad said sharply. Honestly, his behavior stunned me, I'd never seen him like that before. Just got to bear it for now, and by tonight, everything will be fine, I thought. But it was clear Mom's relatives had really soured his mood. The wedding wasn't being celebrated at a cafe or restaurant, instead, it was held at the groom's house. To me, it felt more like a wake than a wedding. The groom lived in an old private house that hadn't seen a renovation in ages. All the guests were crammed into the living room. I sat down on this ancient stool, hoping it wouldn't fall apart beneath me. While they set the table, I looked around the room and noticed something odd. The place was full of icons, but not the usual kind. I'd never seen images like these. They showed saints' faces, but none were familiar to me. The saints looked eerie, their skin far too pale, and the black backgrounds of the icons only made it worse. When they brought the food, I practically threw myself at it because I was starving. But I regretted it soon enough. The food tasted awful. It felt like the cooks were competing to see who could make the worst dish. The menu was strange, borderline bizarre: beet salad, rye bread with herring paste, herring under a coat of shredded vegetables, Russian salad, and potatoes with chicken. There wasn't a single drop of alcohol on the table, not even the mild stuff. Fine, maybe they'd poured everything into carafes or removed the labels from bottles, but no, all I saw were juice cartons and bottles of water. I tried to comfort myself, thinking maybe the newlyweds were just poor, and as for the icons, well, they are just pictures, right? How was I supposed to know at my age? We got home around 5 in the evening. My stomach finally started hurting after all that food, which wasn't surprising. At first, my parents didn't believe me, but when beads of sweat formed on my forehead, and I grabbed my stomach and yelled in pain, they quickly packed up, got in the car, and drove us home. I didn't care about anything else, I just wanted relief from the pain. Once we got home, the first thing Mom did was give me some pills, and I was so relieved when they finally kicked in. That day had drained me completely, so I went to bed before 8 that night. The next morning, a noise from the kitchen woke me up. I barely opened my eyes and wanted to drift back to sleep, but I realized I needed to use the bathroom. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, I heard Mom call from the kitchen, "Awake. Come have breakfast." "Mom, it's still early." "Early? Please. No more lying in bed until lunchtime." I was wide awake now, and along with it, my appetite kicked in. I rushed to the table, eagerly anticipating breakfast. I was hoping for boiled sausages or maybe some cheese sandwiches. Instead of the usual, though, she set down a bowl with some sort of mush in front of me. "Mom, what's this?" "Oatmeal," she answered flatly. "I can see it's oatmeal. But why does it look so weird?" "It's made with water." I scooped up a little of the mush and put it in my mouth. It tasted bland. "I'm not eating this," I said, putting the spoon down. Mom threw her own spoon onto her plate with a clatter and asked, "And who asked you?" "Eat it, now." "Mom, what's wrong with you? And where's the real food?" Just then, Dad walked into the kitchen, also unfazed, and answered in the same deadpan way, "This is real food." "What, you don't like it?" "But we've never eaten this stuff before." "We do now." I stifled a laugh and asked, "Dad, is this some kind of joke?" "No," Dad replied with a stone-cold face. I looked at my parents, not recognizing them at all. "Mom, Dad, what's going on with you?" "Nothing. Your father and I realized we've been living too easy, and some people don't even have food this good." "All right, is this, like, for Lent or something?" Dad couldn't hold it in anymore. He slammed his fist on the table as hard as he could and shouted, "Eat it, or get out." I tried to force down a few more spoonfuls of this grey, tasteless sludge, but I couldn't manage more than 3 bites. I thought this nonsense might end in a few days, and things would go back to normal. But no, it only got worse. The food in the fridge quickly ran low, and we ended up with the same things on the table almost every day: porridge made with water, no butter, barely any salt or sugar, watery vegetable soups, salads made from canned fish. Sometimes, if I was lucky, there'd be some pasta with a single sausage or fried potatoes for dinner. I never thought I'd find myself actually getting excited about pasta or potatoes. But then the new rules didn't just apply to food. They banned me from playing on the computer or watching TV in the evenings. I was only allowed to do that during the day. And soon enough, my parents decided that even an hour a day was too much. And the only thing I could watch was what they specifically allowed. They also took away my phone, saying I was glued to it all day. I never thought I'd miss school this much. All my friends were away, so I figured I'd just hang around the house or maybe go out with my parents. But now, I was trying to figure out how to stay sane within these 4 walls, and I started begging them to let me visit Grandma. My grandma lived in a small apartment in the suburbs. She was always happy to have me over. As for me, I didn't exactly love staying there. It's not that I didn't love Grandma, I did, but I just couldn't spend too long at her place without getting bored. She didn't have cable, no computer either, and I'd get tired of my phone pretty quickly. I didn't have any friends there, so there wasn't much to do. But now that my house felt like a prison, I realized Grandma was probably the only normal person left in the family and definitely needed to know what was happening at home. My parents reluctantly agreed to take me to Grandma's. I had to persuade them for a long time and swear that everything would be fine and they wouldn't need to worry about anything. We took public transportation to get to Grandma's. When I asked why we weren't taking the car, Mom said we wouldn't have it for much longer, they were putting it up for sale. I thought maybe our family had gotten into some kind of financial trouble, maybe debts or something. But I suspected there was more to it than that. Grandma was waiting for us at the bus stop. She invited both of us to come in, but Mom excused herself, saying she had things to do, and after crossing the street, she hopped on the first bus that came by. Grandma was so happy to see me. It was obvious she prepared for my visit. The apartment wasn't just clean, it was spotless, and the table was piled high with food. I, who hadn't had a decent meal in over 2 weeks, quickly washed my hands and headed straight for the table. "Goodness, Jorik, you that hungry? Want some tea?" Grandma asked with a laugh. I mumbled something like, "Aha," and stuffed pies into my mouth with both hands until I started choking. That's when Grandma finally noticed something was wrong. "What's going on with you? Why aren't you even chewing properly? And why are you eating with both hands?" she asked, setting a cup of tea in front of me. That's when I realized I was finally safe. I let it all out, telling her everything, from the day of the wedding up to today. I even told her how they said they wanted to sell the car and warned me not to complain to her about anything. Grandma listened to everything, then got up from the table, opened the cabinet, and took out a small bottle. She poured a few drops of some strong-smelling liquid into a glass, downed it in one gulp, and declared, "Oh, I'll show them. Just wait." I held my breath, waiting to see what she'd do next. Grandma grabbed the cordless phone and, closing the door tightly behind her, began making calls. I could hear her yelling, saying something about a cult, accusing them of brainwashing, shouting that she'd go to the police, saying she wouldn't let them take me, and more. Meanwhile, I was imagining the worst possible scenarios for what would happen when I went back home. After a while, Grandma returned and assured me that everything was settled. But I didn't believe her. I was practically in hysterics, realizing that this wouldn't end well. And that's exactly how it turned out. Half an hour later, there was loud banging on the door. Grandma had intended not to let them in, but in the end, she opened it and an argument broke out immediately. Mom and Dad started trying to reason with her, accusing her of meddling in their family business. Grandma shouted back, calling them cult members. That's when Dad lost it and yelled, "Katia, we're leaving, and we're taking the kid with us. You'll never see him again." Grandma tried to stand between us to protect me, but Dad, without hesitation, pushed her aside. Mom stood nearby, silently watching the whole thing without intervening. "Jorik, you're staying here with Grandma," she suddenly blurted out, but Dad wasn't having it. He grabbed my arm and started dragging me to the door, while Grandma begged him to leave me with her, but it was no use. In the car, on the way home, I sat quietly, not daring to ask any questions. On the way home, Dad and Mom didn't speak to each other. As soon as we arrived, before I could even get my bearings, Dad poured a pile of dry grains into a large bowl and said sternly, "Step into the bowl. This is your punishment for daring to go against us and complain to Grandma." I shook my head, refusing to follow his order, but he walked over, grabbed me by the collar, and forced me into the bowl. If they're saving money on everything, it seems they didn't mind wasting some grain on me, I thought. I stood there for 2 hours, and when my generous parents decided that was enough, I tried to step out, but my legs had gone numb. I lost my balance and hit the floor hard. Of course, no one helped me up. I went to the bathroom, cleaning the scrapes on my knees with hydrogen peroxide, thinking that things couldn't get any worse. But I was wrong. Starting the next morning, I was only given plain porridge and boiled potatoes to eat. They completely stopped letting me go outside. Mom decided to quit her job to keep an eye on me while Dad continued working, for a while, at least. But even that didn't last. Over time, both of them stopped working entirely. I kept hoping Grandma would be able to help me. She didn't give up on trying to take me in. She kept calling, stopping by, and even came over once with the police. But by then, my bruises had faded, and as for the scrapes on my knees, she told the officers it was just childish roughhousing, saying I'd fallen on my own. I stood there like a fool, nodding along while the officers had their backs to me. Soon after, they cut off the internet at home for non-payment, and phone calls eventually became impossible, too. One day, while Mom was on the phone with the housing office, I began to realize just how bad things had gotten. She was practically scolding the employee on the other end, saying, "So what if you provide essential services? If we want, we'll live here for free." I listened, not believing my ears. Mom, who had always been so careful about money and avoided debt, was now demanding free utilities as if her entire mindset had shifted. During this time, I lived in constant tension and fear. Mom seemed completely detached, and Dad looked like he hated me. I have to say, even between themselves, they no longer interacted like they used to. Now they treated each other with cold indifference, like neighbors who barely knew each other. One morning, they both left, not forgetting to wake me up and feed me the same disgusting food. I thought I'd finally be able to have some time alone, away from their strict supervision, and most importantly, I could try calling Grandma. My phone had long since disappeared, most likely sold to a pawn shop, but I figured I could use the neighbor's phone. I waited about 20 minutes, certain they wouldn't be back soon, then rushed to the hallway. But I wasn't able to go next door. The keys weren't in their usual spot. After a futile search, I realized that my parents had deliberately taken my set of keys. Overwhelmed with helplessness, I broke down in tears and went back to my room. I didn't know how much time had passed since I'd fallen asleep on my bed. I was jolted awake by the sound of the lock turning. Voices drifted in from the hallway, and I realized that besides my parents, someone else was there too. The voice sounded familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. They all went into the kitchen without checking on me. A few minutes later, I heard Mom say, "Everything's ready. Call in our son." An intense feeling of dread washed over me. For some reason, I felt a wild fear, like a flashing red light was going off in my mind, warning me of danger. I got up from the bed, stepped into the hallway, and slowly made my way to the kitchen. The next second, I screamed in horror. The entire kitchen was covered in blood. The floor, furniture, walls, and even the ceiling were smeared with it. On the table lay a goat with its belly slit open, its insides visible under the harsh light, and blood was dripping from the open wound onto the floor. "Shut up!" Dad snapped, punching the wall right above my head. What is this?" I whispered, barely able to breathe from fear. "It's a goat," Mom answered flatly. "I can see it's a goat. What's going on here?" "Why is your son speaking to you like that?" said the familiar voice, turning to Dad. Now I recognized him. It was the groom from the wedding. "We'll take care of it," Dad assured him. "Sasha, first of all, you can't talk to your parents like that. After all, they brought you into this world. And second, here," he said, handing me a fork. I took it with a trembling hand, staring at him. "Go on," he said ceremoniously. What do you mean?" I asked, not understanding. "Sometimes we have to sacrifice animals in the name of our Almighty. By eating raw meat, you prove your devotion and bring yourself closer to Him. So go ahead." "I'm not doing it," I said firmly. "And who asked you?" he said, looking over at my parents. "Mom, Dad, what's going on with you?" "Nothing. Just do as you're told," Mom replied calmly. "Wait, have you both eaten this too?" I asked, horrified. "We have," Mom answered without a trace of emotion. That was the final straw. My lips started to tremble, and tears streamed down my face. "What are you crying about?" "Watch how it's done," Dad said, deftly cutting a piece of meat with a knife and popping it into his mouth with such relish that you'd think he was eating a juicy steak from a fancy restaurant, not raw goat. My nerves couldn't take it. I bolted for the front door, shouting something as I ran. Dad and Mom immediately lunged after me, leaving me no chance to escape. I screamed until they clamped a hand over my mouth and dragged me away from the door. My hope faded more with each passing day. After they covered my mouth, Dad and Mom forcibly dragged me back to my room and locked the door. Alone again, I lay on the bed, barely holding back tears, thinking about how to escape this nightmare. As terrifying as it is, I'd rather die than live in this hell, I thought to myself. A few hours later, they returned. Dad opened the door and shot me a piercing look. He told me, "You're no longer our son if you refuse to follow our traditions." "Get out," he shouted, pulling out a huge knife, the one he usually used to carve meat. He looked at me with a cold, unfamiliar stare, as if I were a stranger. Mom nodded and added, "He's right. You're no longer part of this family." I realized things had gone way too far. Feeling fear gripping me, I instinctively ran toward the window. My legs moved on their own. In one swift motion, I opened the window and, without thinking, jumped from the second floor. Luckily, I barely felt any pain. Fear was driving me forward. I glanced back at the house and saw my parents in the bedroom window. They were standing there, glaring at me with undisguised hatred. I felt an even deeper terror and kept running until I reached the street, where I stumbled upon a group of young people. They stopped when they saw me, with my arms and knees scraped and torn, and immediately started asking what had happened. No longer holding back tears, I told them everything. They didn't waste any time and called the police. The officers arrived surprisingly fast, and I spent the rest of the night at the station, giving my statement. By morning, Grandma came to pick me up. She looked exhausted and worried but was clearly relieved to see me. My parents were stripped of their parental rights and sent for mandatory treatment. Grandma took custody of me and promised we'd spend the whole summer at her place, and in the fall, after some renovations, we'd move into my parents' apartment. Life finally began to flow quietly and peacefully, just like before, only now, without my parents. One summer day, I was flipping through TV channels looking for something interesting when I stumbled across a local news report. They were reporting on a leader suspected of running a criminal cult. He was already in custody, and a trial was planned. His face appeared on the screen, and I froze in horror. It was the same groom who had once lured us to his wedding. It turned out that this cult sacrificed animals and, at times, even humans. Members of the cult ate raw meat as part of a ritual, claiming it brought them closer to a higher power. People involved with the cult were encouraged to hand over all their savings, and some even sold off their property, cars, gold, anything to please the leader. I realized that at that wedding, my parents had been brainwashed, which explained why they had become so distant and cruel. The day I saw the news about the cult and found out that its leader had finally been arrested, it felt like a weight lifted off my heart. Realizing that this horrific chapter might finally be over, I felt relief. The memories of those horrors were still fresh, but now, as I looked at Grandma, I knew I had nothing left to fear. The summer passed relatively peacefully. Grandma did everything she could to make me feel comfortable. She was always there, cooking delicious meals and giving me all the attention I needed. But every now and then, I'd catch myself flinching at unexpected sounds, my thoughts drifting back to that night when my parents forced me to witness the horrific sacrifice. Fall came. Grandma kept her promise. She renovated my parents' apartment and we moved in. Despite the apartment's fresh look, it was hard to be in a place that held so many memories of the past. But Grandma did everything possible to help me cope with my anxieties, even getting me a kitten so I wouldn't feel alone. After some time, I learned that my parents had been declared permanently insane and remained in mandatory treatment. Strangely enough, this news brought me some relief. I understood that they could no longer harm me, and maybe, one day, they might come to their senses and realize what they had done. It took several years before I could fully return to a normal life. I made new friends at school, and gradually, I began to put that terrifying chapter of my life behind me. However, the lessons I learned from that experience stayed with me forever. I grew to appreciate the simple things, a peaceful morning, a regular breakfast, the care of those close to me. The memory of that day when I escaped my parents' madness and found help has stayed with me. Now I know there's always a way out, even from the darkest places, and that true family isn't always the people we're related to by blood, it's those who are willing to protect us and accept us for who we are.